because this monster in our culture is kind of the embodiment of fear, I also wanted to make sure that the audience could project their own personal fears onto it until the end of the movie. And I knew that we would need a reveal, and we really tried to design the creature to be kind of the embodiment of evil.
I noticed very early in this movie is that even though it's very specific, it's Indian American characters. Um, you know, I found it profoundly relatable. I'm first generation Latino on my mom's side, um, and I think that everyone in this country, famously made by immigrants, can kind of identify with the idea of having a culture beyond just being American and having that identity crisis, right?
Right. I think so.
Can you tell me a little bit, if it's not too personal, about you having that identity crisis and how it went into the making of this movie?
I mean, I started off, I was born in India. I lived there until I was 4. And then I lived in Canada for a long time. And then I moved to the US and lived across many, many states. So I was really traveling a lot. And, for me, um, I felt kind of caught between two worlds a little bit and not sure which side. And it feels when you're younger, I think certainly in middle school and high school, it feels very binary. And for me, it felt like what I could kind of do was make a movie about how when you're caught between these two worlds, you have to kind of synthesize a identity based on the two of them. That felt like a great sort of conflict, a central conflict for the characters of this movie.
Totally. I mean, and there's two sides to it. On one side, it is this wonderful metaphor about a young girl coming to terms with who she is. But on the other side, you've got a sick monster.
Thanks, man. No, that was what was exciting too. As much as it was about the sort of personal cultural components, I also was drawing from some of these sort of ghost stories that I heard growing up. These very fun stories where I was thinking like, oh, these have been passed down through generations for a reason. Like there's something very universal about them. There's something, kind of sitting at a campfire and hearing about scary stuff. Like there's really something amazing about that for me.
Tell me about striking or finding the tone of being like a high school movie about these young girls who've drifted apart and trying to make their way through that horrible battlefield of high school,
For
or
sure. I mean,
horrible
I
for me.
was
I don't
drawing.
know.
No, I was certainly drawing from some of my favorite, both horror films and teen films. And I think when I think about kind of my favorites, like for example, I think a lot about the John Carpenter Christine from 1983. That's a movie that really, really impacted me because of how kind of psychologically intense it is. It's a great horror film, but it's also so psychologically perturbing and gets into gets into so much of what it feels like to be a teenager. So I love that kind of balance in that film. I thought a lot about a movie like Ginger Snaps, right, which is a tremendous film and balances the two so well. So I think for me it was really about finding a balance that does a service to both, that doesn't undercut either the kind of horror components or the cultural and teen components of the film.
Did you find that that balance during editing, or did was that right down to the script? Tell me about do you go, oh, maybe this part's too scary, or maybe this part needs a little more to it? Tell me about
It's
that balance.
something, I think it's something you're calibrating from the beginning to the end. And that's so much of what makes editing fun, is that you're finding the rhythm and you're, playing on the audience in that way where you're going, it's been too long since we've had this kind of beat, or it's been, it's too little time between these kinds of beats. But really that conversation starts with the script. On this movie, I was working with amazing producers, Ray and Sean at QC, who made incredible films in the subgenre. And, we were always trying to calibrate the film to that tonal balance that we wanted. But one of the things I learned was that there's no real such thing as a final draft until the movie is out to an audience, because we're always working on getting the film to be the right sort of tenor for an audience.
And kind of going back to like the inception of this, this is your feature directorial debut. You've made a bunch of shorts, you've done TV, you've been in this business for a while, but was what made this the movie that you were like, all right, this is my statement?
For me, this one, it's just so personal, as you can see, and it felt like I was able to take my love of the horror genre and kind of merge it with something that felt so real. And I think it just, for me, the experience of making this film, I just felt such a deep connection with the emotions that the characters were feeling. And then working with these actors, those emotions just got bigger and bigger. So I think it was a great sort of pairing for me of the central emotions of the story with the genre. It was like, I can't imagine a better first movie for me.
I think something that you did so great was the escalation of like the horror and the tone of it. Like, it starts out as this, mysterious kind of jar of smoke,
Yeah,
if you
right.
will, and then it's invisible, and not going to spoil it in the interview, of course. But then, by the end, it's this CG guy in a suit, like, awesome, really scary looking. The way it breathed, oh man, forget about it.
Amazing.
But so it's surprised, that well, is because I'm like, I don't know where this movie's going, and to see it to go every step, it's like, oh yeah, this guy knows what he's doing.
Thank you so much. Well, look, I mean, I was certainly drawing, I'm not being original by saying this at all, but I was certainly drawing on the sort of Jaws and Alien approach. And I wanted to have this kind of escalation, like you said, where we suggest presence, where we suggest kind of speed and ferocity and all these things. But because this monster in our culture is kind of the embodiment of fear, I also wanted to make sure that the audience could project their own personal fears onto it until the end of the movie. And I knew that we would need a reveal, and we really tried to design the creature to be kind of the embodiment of evil.
I love the way you said that, about being inspired by Jaws and Alien, and it's so interesting to me how replacing, even if it was a straight Jaws ripoff, which is absolutely not,
right?
It's interesting to me how much of a difference replacing those characters who are portrayed as kind of generic in racially,
right?
Who treat Hollywood for 100 years has treated white as just the standard,
right,
and everything else is exotic in some way,
right?
But just replacing them with people of culture, people of color who have an identity,
right?
100%. That's such a big deal.
It's, again, I think it's that wonderful thing about how essentially the more specific a movie gets, the more universal it starts to feel. And this particular movie, I felt that what I was going through wasn't specific to just Indian Americans or even to immigrants. I felt like, we all live in a world today where we feel like we're part of multiple communities, have multiple identities, and it's really kind of the way that we all find a bridge between those things and kind of live in harmony within those identities. And I just felt like the more specific I could be to my experience, the more it was going to connect with a wider audience.
Right, because we've all been there, to high school,
right?
And even if you say you had a great experience in high school, you probably didn't. It sucked. It was the worst.
Yeah.
and be and everyone can relate to that.
Yeah.
And when you add these extra elements to it, it's like, oh my gosh, high school is hard enough, and you're renouncing your heritage.
Right.
High school is hard enough, and the boy you just kissed got mauled. The high school is hard enough, and then to make it a horror movie is so natural.
Thank you. No, I agree.
Okay, so tell me a little bit about working with these producers, getting the Get Out seal of approval right there on the poster. That's such a big deal.
It was a
Um,
huge deal. No, it really was, and I think that it was two things, right? First and foremost, it was a steady hand because they had done this kind of film and they'd done it incredibly well. But it was the other piece of it too was that because they had done something like Get Out, they were always encouraging me to do something different. And I think the beauty of a film like Get Out and what it did for our culture was that it pushed the conversation beyond a simple binary, of like, this is racism, this is not. And we really could get into the subtleties and the nuances. And I always said from the beginning about this film that this one, It Lives Inside, is more about the stuff that comes from within us, the things we feel about ourselves. And that was just something that really kind of resonated across the process, and they were always encouraging me to make this one specific to what I wanted to make this film.
this just popped into mind, but is there going to be any any weird backlash of people going, "Oh, this guy has got Indian monsters. That is vilifying our culture." Did you have any kind of thoughts about that?
No, certainly. I mean, people have so many feelings about horror films, but precisely because of that, I wanted to foreground this sort of community that forms, right? The sort of togetherness that Sam finds with her family, especially. And I think that was the important part for me, was that the movie ended in a way where this demon, which is a part of our culture, and I think there's a lot of fun to be had in representing those parts of our culture. But beyond that, the fact that um, we were focusing on characters that were using their culture to, and things like the food, were using those things to actively defeat the monster. That to me was kind of the core of what we were trying to say. And so far people have really resonated with that.
Very different vibes. But I'm wondering now if there was any backlash, like when Leprechaun came out from like the Irish community.
That's a really good point. Will have to read about that. It's such an interesting film.
Yeah. But again, very different vibes from this film.
Yes.
This is your first movie. It's going to be huge. Um, you've got, the Hollywood is your oyster. Is there, do you have the next one lined up, or do you have, just like the dreams in your head that you've always had, and now you're like, well, I made a movie, so now I can actually, do it.
Honestly, man, I mean, it's a mix of those things. I have my sort of shoot for the moon kind of goals for sure, but really one of the privileges with this movie was getting to do a kind of high concept original thriller, and that in itself today, that it's coming out theatrically and an audience is going to see it, and it isn't a remake or a reboot or a sequel like that. That's such a privilege, and I just am kind of like, well, I'd love to keep doing those, and I have a couple of ideas that I'm working on that I think are really going to be exciting to an audience because they're unique, they're scary, and first and foremost, what I'm thinking about is making thrillers that get an audience to go home and say, "What would I do in that situation?" Because that's what I love about movies.
Whatever you do next, writer director, that credit really means a lot.
Yeah.
It makes it feel like this is your, any movie that has written and directed by a single person, that carries more weight to me.
Right.
I don't know. Maybe that's not fair to the other movies that are incredible, but
No, but I appreciate you saying that. It is a very unique experience to write and direct a movie.